Case 1. Susan Diane Eubanks. She was a single mother of 4 boys, overwhelmed, volatile, and drowning in the chaos of her own unraveling life. Susan Diane Eubanks had once smiled for school photos and clapped at soccer games. But behind closed doors, the picture was darker, marred by years of failed relationships, substance abuse, and a growing storm of bitterness. By the fall of 1997, Susan was spiraling. She had recently been kicked out of her boyfriend's home, her ex-husband was fighting for custody, and the weight of her collapsing world pushed her closer to the edge. Her fuse was short, her anger explosive. But no one could have predicted what she would do next. On October 26, inside her San Marcos, California home, Susan loaded a revolver and made a decision that would stun the nation. One by one she called her sons, Brandon 14, Austin 7, Brigham 6, Matthew just 4, into the bedroom. She shot each of them at close range. Then she turned the gun on herself. But her suicide attempt failed. She lived. They didn't. Investigators arrived to a scene of unspeakable horror. 4 young boys lying lifeless, a mother bleeding but alive. Her motive? Prosecutors would argue it was rage. Rage toward the men who had left her, toward the courts that challenged her custody, toward a life she could no longer control. Revenge, they said, disguised as a mother's despair. Her defense claimed she was mentally ill, overwhelmed by depression and abuse. But jurors saw calculation in her actions. They saw a woman who had lined her children up, one by one, and fired. In 1999, Susan Diane Eubanks was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She was 33 when she killed her sons. Today she is 60 years old and sits on California's death row, her name etched in history as one of the rare women sentenced to die for murdering her own children. The question that still haunts everyone who knew her: how does a mother reach that point? How does love turn into something so final, so devastating? Case 2. Veronica Utilia Gonzalez. She was trusted with the care of a vulnerable child, but inside the modest duplex in Harlingen, Texas, Veronica Utilia Gonzalez became the architect of a child's nightmare. In 1995, Veronica, just 27 years old, was living with her partner Ivan Gonzalez when they took custody of her 4-year-old niece, Jenny Rojas. What should have been a safe haven became a house of horror. Behind closed doors, Jenny endured weeks, perhaps months, of escalating abuse. She was beaten with belts, burned with curling irons, starved and confined. Sometimes she was locked in a closet. Sometimes forced to lie motionless on the floor for hours. The cruelty wasn't random, it was routine. And it all came to a horrific end in July of 1995. Jenny was found dead, her tiny body stuffed inside a plastic storage container and hidden inside a bedroom. Veronica called 911 days after the fact, claiming Jenny had suffered a fall. But the bruises, burns, and fractures told a far darker story. Authorities and prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of systematic torture. Not a momentary lapse, but a slow, deliberate campaign of violence. Veronica admitted to hiding the body out of fear, but never fully accepted responsibility for the child's death. Her partner, Ivan, was also charged and tried. The motive? Veronica claimed it was discipline, that her actions were meant to teach the child obedience. But the evidence showed otherwise. It was rage. It was neglect. It was unchecked anger directed at the most defenseless victim imaginable. In 1998, Veronica Utilia Gonzalez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Ivan Gonzalez received life in prison. Veronica became one of the rare women on Texas death row, and the first woman sentenced to death in Cameron County in over a century. She was 27 years old at the time of the crime. Today she's 56. Case 3. Socorro Caro. From the outside it looked like a dream. A sprawling California home. 3 beautiful children. A husband who was a respected neurosurgeon. Socorro Caro seemed to live the life others envied. A picture-perfect family in an upscale community. But behind the manicured lawns and designer smiles, something was deeply fractured. Caro, a 41-year-old mother of 3, wasn't just dealing with domestic struggles, she was unraveling. Beneath the surface of privilege was a woman plagued by depression, resentment, and a growing paranoia that her carefully crafted world was slipping away. Her marriage was strained. Custody battles loomed. And her identity, as a wife, as a mother, felt under siege. Then came November 22, 1999. A night that would forever shatter the illusion. While her children, Xavier 11, Joshua 8, and Cassandra just 5, slept peacefully in their beds, Cora walked from room to room carrying a 9mm handgun. She shot each of them execution-style once in the head. No struggle. No warning. She then turned the gun on herself, firing a round into her own chin. She survived. When police arrived, they found a chilling stillness. 3 young lives gone in an instant. No sign of forced entry. No intruder. Just a mother sitting among the wreckage, bloodied but alive. Investigators quickly uncovered a grim motive. Cora feared losing custody of her children in a contentious divorce. Rather than risk that loss, she made a decision rooted in control. If she couldn't have them, no one would. Psychologists would later describe her as a textbook family annihilator. A parent who views their children not as independent lives, but as extensions of themselves. In Cora's mind, their deaths were not murders, but a final act of possession. In court, she showed little emotion. Prosecutors painted her as cold and calculated. Her defense argued mental illness, citing her deepening depression. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 2002, Socorro Caro was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She was 41 when she killed her children. Today she is 65 and remains on California's death row, the only woman in the state's history to kill all of her children in one night. Her story is a chilling reminder that violence doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes dressed in silk, smiling for Christmas cards, while hiding a storm within. Because in the case of Cora Caro, the real danger wasn't what she feared would be taken from her. It was the terrifying extent to which she was willing to go, to make sure no one else could have it. Case 4. Cathy Lyn Sarinana. In Corona, California, the Sarinana household appeared ordinary to neighbors. Cathy Lyn Sarinana and her husband, Raul Ricardo Sarinana, were entrusted with the care of Cathy's nephews, Ricky and Conrad Morales, after their mother faced legal troubles. However, behind closed doors, 11-year-old Ricky Morales endured relentless abuse. Teachers noticed his bruises and emaciated appearance, but the couple's explanations deflected suspicion. On December 25, 2005, the abuse culminated in tragedy. Ricky was beaten to death, his body weighing a mere 50 pounds due to prolonged malnutrition and physical trauma. Instead of seeking help, the Sarinanas concealed his body in a closet. Days later, concerned relatives prompted a police investigation. Authorities discovered Ricky's lifeless body and subsequently the remains of his 13-year-old brother, Conrad, encased in concrete in the backyard, a victim of an earlier, unreported murder. During interrogations, Cathy claimed that the discipline had escalated unintentionally. However, evidence revealed a pattern of systematic torture, including beatings with electrical cords and cigarette burns. In 2009, Cathy Lyn Sarinana was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. Raul Sarinana received the same sentence. Cathy was 42 at the time of the crime. Today she is 61, awaiting execution at the Central California Women's Facility. Case 5. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was just 24 years old when she met James Marlowe, a recently released convict with Aryan Brotherhood ties, a violent temper, and a criminal record longer than most rap sheets. She was a former waitress from St. Louis with a troubled past of her own. The two locked eyes and what followed was a whirlwind of obsession, drugs, and death. Together they embarked on a crime spree that shocked the state. Over the course of just a few weeks in the fall of 1986, 4 women were abducted across Southern California, each one assaulted, tortured, and murdered. Their names were Sandra Neary, Lynell Murray, Pamela Simmons, and Karina Novus. Each woman disappeared without warning. And each was found days later, their bodies dumped like garbage, showing signs of strangulation and sexual violence. The victims were strangers. The pattern was terrifying. Investigators followed the trail, stolen credit cards, eyewitness accounts, and eventually, the pair's capture in an abandoned house in Arizona. What they found painted a disturbing picture, not just of cold-blooded murder, but of a twisted power dynamic between 2 lovers on the run. Cynthia claimed she was a hostage too. She told authorities she had been beaten, brainwashed, and threatened into following Marlowe's every order. Her attorneys leaned heavily on battered woman syndrome, arguing that she was more victim than accomplice. But the evidence said otherwise. Prosecutors revealed that Cynthia had actively participated in the crimes, helping to lure victims, restrain them, and even taunt them. In some cases, her fingerprints were on the weapons. She had opportunities to escape. She never did. In court, the jury didn't see a victim. They saw a predator. In 1989, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was convicted of first-degree murder in multiple cases and sentenced to death. Her lover, James Marlowe, also received the death penalty. To this day, her case remains controversial. Was she a woman trapped in a violent relationship, too scared to say no? Or was she a willing partner in a killing spree fueled by lust and domination? Cynthia was 24 years old at the time of the crimes. Today she is 62, still on California's death row, held at the Central California Women's Facility. In her own words, she once said, "I was scared of him. I didn't know what to do." But the courts weren't convinced. They saw not a scared girl but a killer. Case 6, Kerry Lyn Dalton. Kerry Lyn Dalton wasn't what most would call a model citizen. By 1988, she was living on the edge of society in San Diego County, tangled in a world of drugs, paranoia, and criminal associates. A small-time dealer and regular meth user, Kerry moved between rundown trailers and sketchy acquaintances, trying to survive in a landscape driven by addiction and desperation. But what happened one night in June of that year would define the rest of her life. According to prosecutors, Kerry and two accomplices lured 23-year-old Irene Melanie May into a trailer in Live Oak Springs. The motive? A rumor that Melanie had stolen drugs and jewelry from Kerry. What allegedly followed was a scene ripped straight from a nightmare. Witnesses claimed Melanie was beaten, shocked with electrical cords, injected with battery acid, and stabbed with knives and a syringe. Some said her body was thrown into a bathtub, others said it was dumped in the desert. One even claimed she was wrapped in a sleeping bag and incinerated. But there was a problem. A huge one. Nobody was ever found. No physical evidence of a murder scene. Not a drop of blood. Not a single trace of Irene May, alive or dead. Kerry maintained her innocence from day one. She said there was no murder, and that the so-called witnesses were unreliable, meth-addled storytellers trying to save themselves from jail time. Her defense pointed out that the prosecution's case hinged almost entirely on inconsistent testimonies, hearsay. Some of those same witnesses changed their stories multiple times. But the jury didn't hesitate. In 1995, 7 years after the alleged crime, Kerry Lyn Dalton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She was 28 years old. Today, she remains on California's death row at the age of 64. Over the years, her case has attracted national attention, not because of its brutality but because of its legal murkiness. How do you convict someone of murder without a body? Legal analysts argue that Kerry's conviction was based more on speculation than solid evidence. The appeals process has dragged on for decades, with questions surrounding due process, inadequate defense, and the credibility of key witnesses. Meanwhile, Irene May's fate remains a haunting mystery. No remains have ever been found. No definitive proof of her death has ever surfaced. Was Kerry Dalton a cold-blooded killer? Or was she a scapegoat, trapped in a world of drugs, rumors, and fear? In her own words, "I've been waiting for the truth to matter. I'm still waiting." Case 7, Margaret and Alan. In the quiet suburbs of Florida, Margaret and Alan was known by many as a caregiver, a nurse, a helping hand to those who couldn't care for themselves. But behind the comforting title of nurse lay a darkness no one expected. Alan was 39 years old in 2005, living in Brevard County, and caring for mentally and physically disabled adults in a makeshift arrangement that blurred the lines between professional caregiving and personal profit. Among those under her supervision was Wenda Wright, a 39-year-old mentally disabled woman who relied on Margaret for safety, shelter, and dignity. But Wenda would never make it out of that house alive. On the afternoon of the murder, a dispute arose between Margaret and Wenda. The exact details remain murky, but prosecutors argued that Wenda had accused Alan of taking her money, possibly disability checks or small savings. Margaret, fearing exposure and desperate to keep control, snapped. Witnesses testified that Alan first beat Wenda severely. Then, in a cold and calculated move, she smothered her with a pillow, methodically ending the life of someone who trusted her completely. The crime scene, later described in court, bore all the signs of a brutal and personal killing. Even more disturbing was what Alan did next. Rather than report the death, she tried to cover it up. She delayed calling 911 and gave conflicting stories to law enforcement. Investigators would later discover that this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, but the culmination of months of neglect, threats, and intimidation toward the vulnerable woman in her care. In 2012, after a lengthy trial and exhaustive testimony from medical experts and family members, Margaret and Alan was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury saw the act not as an accident or heat-of-the-moment tragedy, but as a deliberate killing committed by someone who abused a position of trust. The sentence was death. Alan, the caregiver, the nurse, the supposed protector, was now the convicted killer. Today, at the age of 58, Margaret Allen remains on Florida's death row. Her case stands as a harrowing example of what happens when power is misused behind closed doors, and when no one is there to speak for the voiceless. Wenda Wright had no voice in that home. But in court, her story was finally heard. As one prosecutor put it, the hands trained to heal became weapons of death. Case 8. Kimberly Diane Cargill. In the small town of Tyler, Texas, Kimberly Diane Cargill was known by neighbors as a busy, if troubled, single mother of 4. But beneath the image of suburban motherhood was a history of chaos, domestic disputes, custody battles, and a string of legal troubles that kept her under constant scrutiny. In 2010, that scrutiny reached a boiling point. Cargill was being investigated for child neglect, and a court hearing loomed. A key witness had been subpoenaed to testify against her. Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with autism, who had occasionally babysat Cargill's children. Cherry was quiet, trusting, and vulnerable. Just days before the hearing, Kimberly picked up Cherry under the pretense of giving her a ride. It would be the last time anyone saw Cherry alive. That night, Cherry's body was found on a rural roadside, burned beyond recognition. Firefighters responding to a brush fire had no idea they were looking at a murder scene. But forensic investigators quickly found the truth. This was no accident. Cherry had been strangled, her body doused in accelerant and set ablaze. The motive? Prosecutors argued that Cargill, terrified of losing custody of her children, eliminated the one person whose testimony could seal her fate in court. And she did it with chilling calculation. In Cargill's home, investigators found damning evidence: gasoline containers, Cherry's belongings, and traces of the accelerant. Her cell phone data placed her at the scene. In court, the narrative became crystal clear. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was a premeditated execution. In 2012, Kimberly Diane Cargill was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. During sentencing, prosecutors played audio of her jailhouse interviews, cold, evasive, and devoid of remorse. To the jury, the evidence spoke louder than any defense. Today, at 57 years old, Kimberly sits on Texas's death row, one of the few women facing execution in the state. Her case stands as a grim reminder of how fear, desperation, and calculated cruelty can lead to the most unforgivable crimes. As one family member of the victim put it, Cherry trusted her. And Kimberly used that trust to silence her, forever. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was the premeditated elimination of a witness. A woman killed not for what she did, but for what she knew. If you found this documentary informative, like and subscribe for more deep-dive investigations into America's most haunting crimes.